Ladies and gentlemen, this is Luke Johnson and Jennifer Avery. Today we're going to do our third installment of Pride and Prejudice. What are we going to try to cover today, Jennifer? Oh, first, before we begin, I don't want to forget this. I want to be an advocate for you. I want you to tell everybody that you're a working editor and teacher, and that you offer certain editing and educational services. And I want to give you an opportunity to present yourself.
Okay. Well, as Luke said, I'm an editor. I'm a content editor, which means that when I edit your novel, I'm not just doing a line edit of grammar and sentence structure and things like that. I check for continuity. I look at dialogue. I look at the flow of the story and things like that. So I'm a content editor, and if you're interested, if you have a book you need edited, you can email me at javery, S as in Stephen, C as in cat, E as in Edward, at gmail.com. And again, that's javery, SCE, at gmail.com. And I can also do creative writing tutoring. I can do grammar tutoring, literature, poetry, things like that. I do adults and children.
And yeah, and I can testify that you will not be disappointed. Jennifer is an incredible worker and has a great deal of attention to detail. So saying all that, let's get into today's lesson. What are we going to be talking about?
Okay, well, we're starting on chapter 8 today in Pride and Prejudice, and I wanted to save this because there's some really amazing conversations, some really great dialogue that takes place in these few chapters, and you get a sense of the characters of Bingley and his sisters and Elizabeth a little bit more in these chapters through these conversations, which is something that a lot of writers have forgotten how to do, is how to develop characters through their dialogue instead of just telling. It's show, don't tell. That's a major rule for creative writing, and she does it so elegantly here. In chapter 8, if you remember, Jane had been invited to Netherfield, and her mother told her to go on the horse because it was going to rain, and of course poor Jane got a cold as a result of this, and so Elizabeth had gone to check on her and to stay with her and see how she's doing, because that's what sisters do. And so she's been there for pretty much most of the day at this point, and it's just the first day. And so the two sisters have been kind of fussing over Jane a little bit, and then they go and they dress for dinner, and they invite, and of course because Elizabeth is there, they invite her to have dinner, and she makes one observation here, that when Jane wasn't right before the sisters kind of forgot about her and didn't really care as much. And so Elizabeth is kind of justified in her opinion of the sisters here, that they don't care as deeply as they profess for Jane, and that it's just entertainment for them to have her around. So after dinner, and we get a little bit about Mr. Hurst here too. Mr. Hurst is just kind of a nothing guy. Like, all he likes to do is eat and sleep and play cards and hunt, maybe. But in any case, so after dinner she goes back and checks with Jane, and we get a little look at what the party at Netherfield talks about the second Elizabeth leaves the room. And Miss Bingley, who is Mr. Bingley's unmarried sister, of course we know that she's kind of after Mr. Darcy, and so anytime that she can undermine a woman that he actually looks at, she takes a chance to do it. And so the minute Elizabeth is out of the room, that Miss Bingley starts in talking about how awful Elizabeth looked when she showed up. Her petticoat was 6 inches deep in mud. She looked completely wild, and they try to kind of get Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy on their side about it. The sisters do, and so and of course Mr. Bingley, who's a really good natured fella, he's like, well, it shows well, her coming this, the sister says, well, it shows the sort of conceited independence that she would come and do this. This is just stupid that she would come and visit her sister all this way. And Mr. Bingley says, well, it shows an affection for her sister. I didn't notice any of this that you're noticing. I think that it was actually kind of sweet. And then, of course, Miss Bingley kind of ignores that, and then she turns to Darcy and said, well, you wouldn't want your sister to display herself in this way. And Mr. Darcy says, well, no, I wouldn't. And then she says, well, I bet that this, she says, I'm afraid, Mr. Darcy, that this adventure has rather affected your admiration of her fine eyes. And Mr. Darcy, being Mr. Darcy, says, not at all. They were brightened by the exercise. And so it's every time that Miss Bingley tries to, you see that Miss Bingley is undermining Darcy at or undermining Elizabeth to Darcy in particular at every turn. And Mr. Darcy just kind of keeps swapping her back and being matter of fact about it. He's not being particularly romantic or mushy about it. He's just being matter of fact and telling her the truth. And that, in a way, kind of shows Mr. Darcy's character. It's like, yeah, he's kind of closed up, and he doesn't talk much, and yeah, he's kind of proud, but he's honest. Okay, he's honest, and he's not like overly. He's not what you might call a fop. That a fop being a man who is who's very concerned about dress and appearances and things like that, and he's not a rake either, which means he's a man that pursues women just to pursue women.
What would be the analog of the fop in our society today? I would say dandy, but even that term is antiquated. I think of Baudelaire being kind of a dandy, but what is the 2017 version of a fop or a dandy for like any younger people that may be listening?
Well, maybe a hipster or a metrosexual. That's
I hadn't thought about hipsters being the modern day equivalent of fops. Everybody loves to rag on hipsters.
Exactly.
I've been told that I'm a hipster too. So, so
I don't see
maybe,
that, Luke.
So maybe I'm allowed to joke about it, but
but yeah, that. And a fop probably would be like a metrosexual or a hipster or something like that. And a rake would be probably a scrub.
You think a rake would be a scrub? The way that I understand a rake would be more like a Don Juan character, a Lothario, I don't know, like a really ripped pool boy that seduces your wife while you're away at work. or
maybe a toxic dude, or I don't know. I'm not entirely. See, I'm too old to be up with the lingo. But I'm sure that our younger viewers will come up with the proper word to describe a rake.
Right.
But in any case, Mr. Darcy is neither of these, and so the way that he kind of dismisses what Miss Bennett says, or not Miss Bennett, but Miss Bingley says, and maintains his opinion, is kind of a little. You can see a little bit more into his character. He's not really a bad guy. He's honest, and so and this continues. And they talk about, and then they start, after all of this about how Elizabeth looks and everything, they start talking about the Bennet's relations. They have an uncle who is an attorney let me see, what is it? Okay, they have an uncle who's an attorney in Meryton, which is the nearby village here, and they look down on that. And they have an uncle who is in trade, as we've discussed before. He's a businessman in Cheapside, and Cheapside is a part of London that was considered very unfashionable because it was mostly industrial. And so they look down on this uncle just because he lives in this area of the city, even though he might not have as much money as the Bingleys, but he got his money in exactly the same way as the Bingleys' father did, through trade. But they're looking down on this guy. And so they're kind of making fun of them, for fun of the sisters for this. And then poor Bingley keeps trying to defend them and says, well, it doesn't matter to me if they had uncles to fill all of Cheapside. They're good people. They're sweet girls. They're intelligent. And Mr. Darcy chimes in and says, well, that the point here is, Bingley, that they have no chance of marrying well because of these connections. And so that's kind of where it gets left, where it gets left for that little bit there. Let me see. Okay, and so they go up and talk to, and they go up and check on Jane, and they decide, well, Jane is just not doing well enough to be moved, and it was getting late, and so they invite Elizabeth to stay. And so after she's been up to see Jane, she comes back down to because it's kind of viewed as polite, if you're a guest, to spend some time with the party at the house. And so what people would do is, after dinner, they would go to a drawing room or something like that. Like, usually the women would go in first, and the men would go to like the billiard room or another room and have brandy and cigars, and then they would come and join the women. And so that's basically what's been going on here. And so Elizabeth goes down into the drawing room, and she picks up a book to read. And then Miss Bingley starts talking about how few books their father left them. Bingley himself says, oh, I wish I had more, but I'm afraid I'm not a big reader. And Elizabeth is okay with that. I'll just read what you've got here. Don't worry about it. And then Miss Darcy starts going in about how many books Darcy has at Pemberley, and how he keeps adding to the collection. And let me see. And then they start talking, and then she suggests to Charles, to the brother, to Mr. Bingley, that when he builds his own house, it should look like Pemberley, which is completely impossible. And so Elizabeth is highly amused by all this, because Elizabeth, being somebody who likes to watch people, who likes to kind of sketch people's character and kind of laughs at their shortcomings and when they're being frivolous or whatnot. And so she's internally laughing her butt off at this point at all this conversation. And so they're talking, and then Miss Bingley asks Darcy about his sister, and they start talking about what it means for a woman to be accomplished. All right, Mr. Bennett, or Mr. Bingley, says, oh, well, it's amazing to me what all women can do, what all these women can do. It's like they all dance and draw and paint, and it's just amazing how accomplished all women are. And then, of course, Miss Bingley comes and shuts him down and says, well, a woman can't be deemed, people use the word too liberally. Women can't be considered accomplished unless they have a certain manner in the way they talk and the way they carry themselves, and that they know modern languages and they can do all these different things. And Darcy agrees that, yeah, it's applied too liberally, that people call women accomplished way too much when they don't deserve the word. And he says that I can't think of half a dozen women who really deserve the word accomplished. And Elizabeth is just, you know, kind of amazed by this, and she's like, you know, you comprehend a great deal in your idea of an accomplished woman, and I rather wonder at you knowing any. And so Mr. Darcy is piqued by this, and Miss Bingley says, "Oh well, what does she say? Oh, what is it? Oh yeah, and then Miss Bingley says, "Well, I rather wonder." Miss Bingley said, "I'm sorry, I'm losing my spot here. I'm
No,
getting
it's
ahead of
okay. Don't
myself."
worry about it.
But but Miss Bingley lists all these things that an accomplished woman can do, and Elizabeth is just like, wow, you know, this would be a really fearsome woman to behold. I've never met a woman like this. And Miss Bingley said, and then Mr. Darcy says, you know, you're really, you know, you're severe on your sex, and and basically Elizabeth says, well, I've never seen a woman like this, so I'm sorry. I mean, I'm just telling you the truth.
Can I ask you a question?
Uh-huh.
So what do you make of all this, these very impressive women? Like what, and I may have asked this in a previous episode, right? The question I'm asking here is, you know, how was it with there was this era in the past where you had, you know, all these polymaths or whatever. What were the conditions that were going on within their society, and you know, how do we stand in relation to it? I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to see if some of this is still within our own culture, if our own culture is a critique of it. What is your estimation of how these conditions arise? Was this a real situation? We just see. Do we see that in our culture now? If we're not seeing it, why aren't we seeing it? What's your estimation of this?
Well, you mean the idea of accomplishment?
Yeah, it's in terms of how it's defined here.
Okay. Well, you know, in Jane Austen's day, a woman was considered accomplished, and that she was therefore looked up to and admired, and that was part of what would attract a husband, is if she could play the piano and sing, that she had enough education. And Mr. Darcy at some point says she has to add, she must possess and add something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. Okay, and all of these things did contribute to whether a woman was accomplished or not. How well she played the piano, how well she danced, whether she could draw, whether she could sing, all of these different things. These days, you know, I don't want to be too negative, but I'm going to be honest.
I wanted your opinion.
Yeah, people don't see any importance in any of this anymore.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you believe those ideals of accomplishment are BS? Do you think there's something valuable to them? And if there is something valuable to them and we don't have them, why don't we have them?
Well, I think yes. To me, they are valuable. But I don't. It's the BS part is that you need them to. You need all of these accomplishments and all this understanding to find a husband. That's the BS part. You need this in order to improve yourself,
Right.
and to recognize what's important in society, to recognize to be able to look back in history, to understand you know, how we got here and where we could be going. People don't do that anymore. And I think the reason why is because it's because of consumerism.
Yeah, aren't we distracted?
We are extremely distracted. People get bored too easily now. If there's nothing good on TV, they feel like they have nothing they can do. Or if they're bored with the game they're playing, then there's nothing they can do. Pick up a freaking book, okay? Take up a hobby. Try painting. Try playing an instrument. Try learning a foreign language, which I need to do. And you know, people don't do that anymore because they get their educations, even college educated people, even advanced degree, people with advanced degrees. Once they get to that point that they feel like they want to get, they don't learn anymore. They cease to learn because they feel like they don't have to anymore. But that keeps your brain young. That keeps your body young, in my opinion. And it helps you to make sense of the situations that we have now, like our political situation. People are the things that we see online that are inaccurate. That critical thinking that we lack these days. And yeah, I mean, it wasn't quite to that extent in those days. It was just to be informed and educated was seen as a benefit.
Well, let me ask you this. I think you and I would both agree that every woman should be given the opportunity to be highly educated. I mean, that's what we're doing here at Noetic, is to give every man, woman, and child a first-rate education, so they don't have to, go into incredible debt,
Yeah.
just to get a humanities degree or something like that, right?
Yeah.
But what about this larger claim about certain feminine virtues being maintained through like dancing and drawing and things of that nature? Are you of the mentality that we've lost something by our young women not having those things? I mean, I don't know. Maybe one day when I have a daughter, I'll be like, no, you're going to take French lessons, and we're going, you're going to go to ballet, and we're going to enroll you in art classes. I just haven't thought about it very much. I'm just kind of curious what your perspective is.
I would probably make a lot of feminists angry by saying this.
As long as you are saying this from a place of good intent, I don't care if you're controversial.
Yeah, because I consider myself a feminist, but I consider myself more of a 70s type feminist. It's where just like if you like whatever a woman wants to do, that's what concerns me. But there is a serious lack in poise and decorum in modern women that I really worry about. And that's not to say that women have to be pretty. It's not to say that women have to be graceful. No, it's not about that. It's about being ladylike, about maintaining this sense of decorum that makes you.
Can I ask for clarification? What do you mean you see a lack of decorum?
Well, in the way that many young women dress, the way that many young women will go out in public and just get completely, utterly tanked and act out. And they say ridiculous things. They have to be the center of attention. They go after, and men do this too. Men do it worse in some ways. But the thing about
I asked you about women, and we're looking at women through this novel. So I mean, it's perfectly okay to just address that side of the equation.
See, and the thing about it with women, when you act out in this way, when you go out or in public and you get completely and utterly tanked, and you start flirting with everything that moves, if you start, saying things that don't, trying to act in a certain way, like that's dangerous for women. And a lot of feminists say, no, it's not the woman's fault, it's rape culture, it's all this. And yeah, yes, rape culture is a serious problem. And yes, men can get away with too much. And no, it's not an excuse that because she was drunk, because she was dressed scantily, I felt like I could do this. No, that's not right either. But it's our fault too. Okay? It's not just one sex or the other. We both have to address this. And the way I feel women should address it is through maintaining that poise and decorum, and not allowing yourself to get into a situation where you don't know what's going on, where you can be easily taken advantage of. Don't let yourself get there. And that's what I mean by lacking that decorum and poise is dangerous for women. If you want to get completely tanked and drunk, stay home. Do it with your friends. Do it with people you trust. That's fine. If you want to do that, do it at home. And if you want to act out and, you know, and dress scantily, if you want to walk around naked, do it at home. That's fine. But it's just, I have a real problem with this wild quality that a lot of young women embrace.
So,
and I'm reserved even for my age, and I get that, and I understand it. If other women don't agree with me, that's fine. That's just my opinion. And that's why I feel like reading these books, reading these older books, and yes, women were very much oppressed. Yes, women did not have the place that they deserved in society. I agree with that. But glean from these things this idea of being ladylike, this idea of having poise and decorum, and watching what you say, watching what you do, because you could expose yourself to not only vitriol and slander, but also to danger. So,
do you think there's a similar lesson in decorum for men from these books?
Yeah, I do. I really do, because and these, like, men in this era, it's like you did not strike a lady, you did not, you didn't make lewd comments to ladies. You spoke to a lady on terms of not, in these days, no, it wasn't equality, but they spoke to women like they were people. In this conversation, at least in these books, the men, I don't know what the reality would have been like, but that's why Jane Austen did this in such a way that maybe it was her ideal. I don't know, but all of the good characters, the heroes in these books, are always very respectful to women, and they actually kind of look at the women, at the heroines in this light of equality, and it may seem paradoxical to some people who read these books, but they really kind of do, at least on a social level. Like, no, the women couldn't work. No, the women couldn't do these other things. And yes, the men probably will look down on them if they did. But just in conversation and day-to-day life and the way that they address each other, yes, the men are more respectful.
So what you're saying here is that there is a moral education that goes on by reading these books.
Yeah,
for both
social education. It's not just a moral, but it's a social education too. And I'm not going to fool myself into thinking that people are going to start acting this way again. And with the enlightenment that we have now, if you can call it that. But it would be nice if some percentage of the population could see the value in this. you know, and I think that enough people do that I can get along in the world, but you know, but in any case, but yeah, I mean, there's a lesson to be learned for both sexes and how these people talk to each other and how they treat each other, and this mutual respect, this lack of objectification. That's the key here. Is there's no objectification as far as the kind that we see these days.
At least within certain caste structures. I mean, I think
yeah,
one could critique that the lower classes would be objectified maybe in a different way. But
yeah.
So I appreciate your opinion. I felt like it was the right time to ask those questions. And if anyone's listening, I had no script there. I had no idea what Jennifer was going to say. So
sorry if I made anybody mad.
Yeah, and I hope no one thinks that I put you up to say what you said. You really dropped some serious truth there. You were pretty brutal. So
well, I don't mean to be. That's just how I feel about things. It really is. And anyway, I like to consider myself a little, not a lady to this extent, but a lady in the new Southern way, I guess.
Right. Well, hey, we keep it real here, so I like it. Right. I like the authenticity. All right, so why don't we get back to the discussion of the text?
Okay, but in any case, like I said, Miss Bingley talks about all the traits of an accomplished woman that she feels deserve the word of accomplished, and Darcy says, well, she has to add reading and improvement of her mind and to deserve the word too. And Lizzie is just like, I can't imagine. I've never saw a woman like this. And so they kind of give her a hard time about that. And again, Elizabeth leaves to go check on Jane and to get ready to go to bed and everything. And as soon as Elizabeth is out the door, and I love this exchange right here because it just gives you the perfect brief illustration of Miss Bingley's character and Darcy's character and how they relate to each other. As soon as Elizabeth's out the door, Miss Bingley says, Eliza Bennet is one of those young ladies who seek to recommend themselves to the other sex by undervaluing their own, and with many men, I dare say, it succeeds. But in my opinion, it is a paltry device, a very mean art. And think about it just for a minute. Isn't that exactly what Miss Bingley is doing right now? Yes, it is. And Darcy says, undoubtedly, there is meanness in all the arts which ladies sometimes condescend to employ for captivation. Whatever bears affinity to cunning is despicable. And so that was just a really subtle just smack to Miss Bennet or to Miss Bingley, because she's doing exactly what she's accusing Elizabeth of doing, which Elizabeth's not really doing that. She's just kind of sharing her opinion about, she's just basically saying that I'm amazed of your idea of this. She's not undermining women. She's just giving her opinion. And she's actually kind of undermining herself in a way, in this kind of humorous way. And Miss Bennet just doesn't. The thing about Miss Bingley is that she doesn't understand. Like, she doesn't understand Elizabeth's. She doesn't have the same understanding of people and personalities that Elizabeth does. Darcy does. And so Miss Bingley sees this and she's jealous of it. And so she undermines Lizzie in any way that she can possibly think of. And she keeps doing it throughout the book. And this is just the first, like, real example of how it's going to be. Because Miss Bingley wants Mr. Darcy. She wants to marry him. And she's decided that she deserves to marry him. And so she's going to do everything she can to make sure that happens. So in any case, And so we have that little exchange with Darcy, and you see that Mr. Darcy shall not be moved. Right? He's got his opinion too, and he thinks that Miss Bingley is doing, he sees that Miss Bingley is doing exactly what she's accusing Elizabeth of doing. He sees it. And so this is kind of when I, anyway, really start to kind of like Mr. Darcy, because he can recognize this, and he understands what Miss Bingley's trying to do, and he understands that Elizabeth is just being Elizabeth. So in any case, Lizzie just ends up staying, and so that pretty much ends chapter 8, and we go into chapter 9, and so basically she spends the night basically with Jane and taking care of Jane. And she sends a note to Longbourn, to Mrs. Bennet, because Elizabeth feels like Mrs. Bennet needs to kind of have a look at Jane and see what she thinks about her condition. And so Mrs. Bennet shows up the next morning. Oh boy. And Mrs. Bennet goes and sees Jane, and she's like, no, and she's like, she's in such bad shape right now. We can't even think of moving her. We've got to keep her here. And of course, although that's probably true at this point, that she's probably in too bad a shape to be moved, you know that Mrs. Bennet is wanting to make sure she stays as long as she can so she can have that time with Mr. Bingley. And so as soon as they pretty much settled that Jane's staying here for the time being, Mrs. Bennet kind of starts in, and she kind of starts kind of playing up the area and playing up Netherfield and complimenting it. And she says to Mr. Bingley, she's like, you're probably going to stay here, aren't you? We hope that you stay here. I can't imagine why you would want to leave. And then we get a start of this conversation, which I absolutely love later on. This is kind of the seed of that. Mrs. Bennet says, you will not think of quitting it in a hurry, I hope, though you have but a short lease. And Mr. Bingley says, whatever I do is done in a hurry, replied he, and therefore if I should resolve to quit Netherfield, I should probably be off in 5 minutes. At present, however, I consider myself as quite fixed here. And Elizabeth kind of likes this about him, and she's like, that's exactly what I would have thought. And again, you get more of Elizabeth's kind of favorite pastime of observing and watching people and trying to understand them. And she says, that's exactly what I would have supposed of you. And Mr. Bingley says, you begin to comprehend me. And she says, yes, I understand you perfectly. And Bingley says, I wish I might take this for a compliment, but to be so easily seen through, I'm afraid is pitiful. And Elizabeth says, that is as it happens. It does not necessarily follow that a deep, intricate character is more or less estimable than such a one as yours. And so they're just kind of playing with each other. And she says, yes, you're easy to figure out, but that doesn't mean that you're not a good person, essentially is what she's saying. And of course, poor Mrs. Bennet, she is too dumb to understand what they're talking about. And she basically gets on to Lizzie for teasing Mr. Bingley, and she doesn't see that it's a pleasant discussion that they're having. But Mr. Bingley kind of, he's like, it's okay. He says, I didn't know that you were a studier of character. And Elizabeth says that, but intricate characters are the most amusing. They have at least that advantage. So, and then Darcy says this. He says, the country can in general supply but few subjects for such a study. In a country neighborhood, you move in a very confined and unvarying society. And Lizzie says, yes, but people themselves alter so much that there is something new to be observed in them forever. And again, there's more of this about her characters, that she just loves, even though there's not a lot of people in this neighborhood, as Mr. Darcy says, she says, well, people change, people alter, and I love to see how they do that, and I wonder why, because I do that too. And that's why I love this book, is because I do this exactly the same thing as Lizzie does. And Mrs. Bennet, she fixates on Darcy saying, well, the country has confined and unvarying society. And she takes it as an insult, of course. And she kind of, you know, gets her feathers ruffled, and she says, well, there's quite enough of that here. And again, she doesn't understand what they're talking about, but she feels offended for some reason. And then she kind of gets on to Mr. Darcy about how London can't be much better, and the country's got to be pleasanter. And poor Elizabeth, she can see that that Mrs. Bennet is kind of getting on to Mr. Darcy about all this, and she's being kind of uncivilized at this point. She's attacking Darcy in a way, and it's a little bit too far. And she's attacking Darcy for something that she doesn't understand. She's attacking him for something that isn't an insult, essentially. And Lizzie kind of tries to rein her back in. She's like, well, you're mistaken, you know, Mama. You mistook Mr. Darcy. He only meant that there was not much of a variety of people to be met with in the country as in town, which you must acknowledge to be true. And of course, Mrs. Bennet just can't figure it out. And so she kind of keeps on. And then finally, Elizabeth just gives up on this, and she says, and she tries to change the subject, and she asks her mother about whether Charlotte Lucas has come to see her, and she said yes, she has. But Mrs. Bennet keeps up, and she says, oh, well, Mr. William Lucas, well, he's a gentleman, he's a good man. This gentleman over here, Mr. Darcy, he doesn't seem to think anything at all of the kind of people that we're with. He doesn't meet my idea of what a refined gentleman is. And Mr. Lucas and Sir William Lucas does, because he has something to say to everybody. He talks to everybody. And it's not, and the thing, and again, here we see this lack of understanding between Mrs. Bennet and what you might consider higher, or more, at least more intelligent society, because she just doesn't get it. She doesn't, unlike Elizabeth, she doesn't see the difference in character in people. And so that's why, and so you begin to, and so Mrs. Bennet has immediately decided she doesn't like Mr. Darcy. She's never going to like Mr. Darcy because he says all these things. And Elizabeth tries to kind of rein Mrs. Bennet in and try to explain things to her, but she never understands them. And that's, again, that kind of gives you a deeper idea of the complexities in the family and how Mrs. Bennet can really kind of be a detriment to some of the girls in a social situation, because she just doesn't understand things, and she just kind of flies off the handle for no reason. And she's too loud, and she keeps it up later on, and they talk, and she basically says, well, I always tell my other girls that they're nothing to Jane. She basically puts down all of her daughters at the same time, saying, I always tell them they need to be more like Jane. I always tell them that they're not near as pretty, they're not near as sweet. Thanks, Mom. And then she goes on to say, well, and she starts to tell the story about this gentleman who wrote Jane poetry, and she keeps kind of building Jane up, and it's obvious what she's doing. She's trying to get Mr. Bingley to just be completely in love with her, and she's trying to puff her up and all this stuff, which Jane wouldn't like. as you have learned about her character earlier, she's kind of quiet and shy. She wouldn't like this. She would be completely embarrassed by it. And Lizzie knows that, and Lizzie knows how obvious it is. And so she keeps trying to rein her mother in. And her mother says, well, there was this young man who wrote all these poems for Jane, and Elizabeth, in an attempt to kind of shut her down, says, and so ended his affection. And I love this little bit too. Said Elizabeth impatiently, there has been many a one, I fancy, overcome in the same way. I wonder who first discovered the efficacy of poetry in driving away love. And Darcy says, I have been used to consider poetry as the food of love. And I love this right here. Of a fine, stout, healthy love, it may. Everything nourishes what is strong already. But if it be only a slight, thin sort of inclination, I'm convinced that one good sonnet would starve it entirely away. And I love this just because that's kind of true. Because yeah, if you write a love poem about somebody and it's just like a vain kind of shallow thing, it's just going to make it go away. If it's a really good one, then yeah, it's going to work. Okay, and so that kind of shut her mother down, but she's still worried she's going to say something else. But luckily, let me see here. But luckily, Mrs. Bennet decides to leave not long after that, and so Lizzie doesn't have to shut her down anymore, rein her in. Right before they leave, Lydia, the youngest daughter, says, oh, well, and this little bit here is a little bit about Lydia, and this becomes important later on. Lydia does. Lydia was a stout, well-grown girl of 15, with a fine complexion and good-humored countenance, a favorite with her mother, whose affection had brought her into public at an early age. She had high animal spirits and a sort of natural self-consequence, which the attentions of the officers, to whom her uncle's good dinners and her own easy manners recommended her, had increased into assurance. She was very equal, therefore, to address Mr. Bingley on the subject of the ball, and abruptly reminded him of his promise. So this little bit about Lydia gives you a good idea of her. She's basically like her mother. She's pretty, and she's got a good humor, and but she's kind of dumb, and she doesn't really own her actions. She doesn't really understand the consequences of her actions, and just because some of the officers have started to kind of pay attention to her, she feels like she is important enough now to directly address someone like Mr. Bingley, which would have been considered kind of poor manners back in those days. And so you kind of see where Lydia is kind of impertinent. And she asks him about this ball, and Mr. Bingley, being a sweet-tempered guy and just being kind of easygoing, says, well, as soon as your sister's well, you'll name the day of the ball. And so that's basically when they leave. Okay, and this last little bit, I like this last little bit of chapter 9. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters then departed, and Elizabeth returned instantly to Jane, leaving her own and her relations' behavior to the remarks of the two ladies and Mr. Darcy, the latter of whom, however, could not be prevailed on to join in their censure of her, in spite of all Miss Bingley's witticisms on fine eyes. So you see that through these conversations and how Elizabeth tries to rein in her mother, and how Elizabeth always has something witty or intelligent to say, and the fact that she recognizes the impertinence of her mother and her sisters, even though Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst kind of keep haranguing on Elizabeth when she's not there, Darcy won't join in. even though Miss Bingley keeps kind of trying to bait him into doing so. And so you begin to see that Darcy's really kind of starting to admire Lizzie. And that's where it really just kind of starts, is in this visit. And that's why this visit is so important in the book, is while Lizzie's there taking care of Jane, Mr. Darcy gets to know Elizabeth a little bit better, and Lizzie begins to get to know Mr. Darcy a little bit better. And you see Mr. Darcy kind of starting to like her. And that, again, that's why this is so important, because because they haven't been spending a lot of time in each other's company, especially because most of the time they see each other, it's in a much larger party, and so they don't really talk to each other a lot. But in this situation, there are fewer people, and so he can watch her more closely and talk to her a little bit more, and so they kind of get to know each other a little bit better here. And again, that's why this is so important. But that's the end of chapter 9. Do you want to keep going, or should we stop here?
It's probably a good stopping point for today.
Okay.
We've recorded 51 minutes of audio.
Okay.
And,
Okay.
But I have to say, you really came alive during this session. We're very animated. I don't know if it was I don't really know what the factor was, but I appreciate the spirited discussion of the text so much, Jennifer. And I know everyone that listened felt that way too. And I'm just so thankful that we have this opportunity to share your insights on all these matters. And I think it's obvious from the demonstration you did today that if anyone wanted Jennifer to help with their personal educational matters or their editing, how can they get in touch with you again?
My email is javerysce@gmail.com, and that's the best way to get a hold of me, is just send me an email. I check it every day, and just put in the subject line editing or tutoring or something like that, or saw you on Noetic or something like that, so I know what's going on. But before we close, I just want to kind of tie a little bow around this part that we did today. It's like mainly I covered that, in that this is an important visit because of the way Darcy and Lizzie kind of start to get to know each other here. And it's also, again, don't forget about that little bit about Bingley saying, well, if somebody asked me to stay, I'd be off in 5 minutes, or asked me to leave. If I decide to do something, I'll be off in 5 minutes, or something like that. Remember that, because, again, the conversation, the dialogue that takes place in this next chapter, in chapter 10 and 11, is just amazing to me, because she brings in a previous conversation into the next conversation, and it just goes from there, and it's just marvelous dialogue, and you could actually see somebody talking about this. And so that's why the next chapter is, I'm looking forward to doing that one, because this is my favorite conversation in English literature that's coming up right here. So, almost. Probably my favorite's the one in Jane Eyre, but
well, this works. This works at a couple levels. You've left the audience hanging, and so they'll be dying for more of it, and we don't have to rush it. We don't have to get it in a short period of time today. So let's take some more time next week to develop it.
Okay.
And I want to thank everyone for listening, and just download the Noetic app. We're going to be going public with the website and all the teachers and everything like that soon. So, and we have a lot of features to offer you now that I can spend all my time working on the company now. All right. Take care, Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you.